Hi all, I'm still Dominique Hazaël-Massieux. Part of my role in WCC is to deal with the impact of AI on the web. You guys are not making it easy. As you can guess, this has been a very slow-moving environment, and making sense of it has been extremely easy. But I'm going to try and engage you in trying to build a clearer picture of where we are, but more importantly, where we need to be as a community in terms of understanding what AI is doing to the web and how we can benefit from its opportunities and mitigate the risk it might create for the web. So the basis for this discussion is this report the team published last year. It's now a year ago. But in this actually fast-moving space, a lot has changed since then. But just to remind you of some of the highlights from the reports last year, in terms of the challenges that were identified emerging from the exposure of AI to web content, the risk around synthetic content and being able to identify it to manage some of that risk, the risk from bias, which is inherent in how these machine learning models are trained. In terms of privacy, what should we be doing to limit the exposure of personally identifiable information through these systems? In terms of safety, the fact that a number of security measures which were analog in their basis were maybe no longer effective in a world of deepfakes, for instance. The cost to the environmental impact of those systems, which is still a hotly discussed topic. A lot of discussions and also still very active around the consent to use web materials for training those models. And maybe more narrowly for our work in the LCC, the impact of these machine learning models in defining interoperable standards. We'll get back to this in this presentation, but the fact that these machine learning models are, for instance, non-deterministic, make it harder to envision how we can integrate them into the web platform. So since that report, a few updates worth highlighting. In terms of synthetic content and detecting some of the risk associated with potentially fake generated content. Zvia, Sigman, and myself, along with a few people of the community, including Chris and Dan, we've started this series of online meetings around the topic of what we call the authentic web. Basically trying to determine what kind of standardization efforts can help increase the trustworthiness of content on the web. We will be looking, we haven't quite started yet, but we will be diving into what technologies such as C2PA, originator profile, of which you heard about yesterday, trust.txt, and other proposals that have been suggested in early conversation in that space. So we'll be diving into these topics through what we hope to be a very structured conversation to understand what these technologies would change to the web, what kind of standardization they might benefit from to have greater impact, if indeed they can have that impact, and figuring out exactly the role of WCC in that space. So we had our first meeting last month, but this will be a series of online meetings. So if you or some of your colleagues are interested in that space, please do get in touch and make sure they are aware of this conversation. In terms of the question around consent to training, how can producers of web content indicate consent or non-consent to have their material used in training? The Internet Architecture Board organized last September a workshop on AI control. A few of you were there. That led to the creation of a working group at the IETF called AI Preferences. They are looking at defining an extensions to robots.txt through a vocabulary to indicate whether a given piece of content should be available for different level of text and data mining. So this is still early work, but this is, among other things, in relation to some of the emerging regulation, among other things in the EU, that try to define what kind of consent needs to be obtained for what kind of processing. So I do encourage you to look at the work of that group if you're interested in that space. In complement to that, we've also been in discussion with Text and Data Mining Reservation Protocol Community Group, who has been looking at the next steps towards standardization. One of the options is WCC, but they are still evaluating how to do that transition and how it would relate to that IETF work. In terms of the interoperable platform of AI on the web, as you may recall, we've started now, I think 4 years ago, the Web Machine Learning Working Group, who has been developing the Web Neural Network API, which basically provides hardware acceleration to run a model inside the web browser. That work is progressing very well. We now have all the browser vendors involved. Lots of great cooperation in understanding the commonalities across devices and platform, again, in that very fast-moving space. But for instance, now WebNN has the necessary support for the so-called transformers, which has been at the core of all the recent innovation in large language models and multimodal models. So lots of good progress, early implementation experience, adoption in the ONNX runtime as well. So very interesting progress in that space for WCC. But looking forward, there is also exploration of a different approach to that same problem space. You will be hearing a lot more about this from one of our upcoming Lightning talks, but the so-called ML-based task APIs are exploring how can you expose specific task-oriented features based on large language models to web developers. So for instance, how could a web developer call a pre-existing, pre-installed model on their device, on the device of the user, to say summarize a piece of content or help rewrite it in a more language appropriate way. So these are completely exploratory. This is happening in the Web Machine Learning Community Group. And again, you'll hear more from this on one of the editors of those specifications. Even more experimental, but also that has surfaced in several environments, the ability to expose an LLM and send a prompt. As you know, most of these machine learning models allow you to interact with them through a prompt-based approach. And so we've seen various browser vendors experimenting with this, both as part of the web machine learning incubations, also through web extensions. Again, there are lots of really tricky questions about how interoperable such an approach can be, but it is showing some of the questions that we as a community are exploring to understand the impact of AI on web browsers. And the hot topic du jour is the so-called AI agents, or the agentic AI, whereby it's no longer that you're interacting with a machine learning model through your browser, but that the machine learning model itself is operating potentially your browser, directing it to say, help complete a purchase, or go through some automated workflows that the user would ask through a chat-like interface. We've seen this type of interactions already in the past. If you think of the vocal assistant that some of you may have been using, they already allow you to interact with the web through machine learning mediated system. But we are seeing that approach being deployed at a much more consequential scale. You may have heard some recent reports of some of these agents being used in programming context, overloading a number of open source code projects and documentation projects. So we had some early discussions at the breakout days that were organized a couple of weeks ago. The minutes are linked from this slide. Part of what we will be discussing both during the panel today and during the breakout this afternoon is try to build a more in-depth picture of how these AI agents may impact the web in general and our work in particular, trying to understand what, if anything, WCC needs to do in that space. The thing with these AI agents, the fact that they add this new layer of mediation between the user and the browser creates some new risk, which is why I feel it would be good for us as a community to look at them in more depth. You're probably all aware that large language models have these so-called hallucinations where they give plausible looking but completely wrong answers. If that's done while you're doing a money transfer in your bank with an agent, this might be problematic. They are also susceptible to the so-called prompt injection, where if you tell them hard enough something, they will do it. And if you think that a web content might break your agent by telling him really strongly that you should be actually paying for something you don't want, that would also be problematic. The fact that they add another layer in the mix creates interesting privacy questions. And maybe more systematically, as Dave was alluded yesterday, if you add these agents to the mix, if the user is no longer facing directly with content, a lot of the assumptions that we've made, for instance, around monetization, where advertising is thought to be useful only when a user actually sees the ad, if it's all done through agents, this creates a number of very systemic questions about how the web operates.